Now, picture this. The world above you has ceased to exist in any way you would recognize. Beyond a ceiling of heavy timber and packed earth, the atmosphere has turned into a screaming, opaque wall of white glass. The wind, a sustained 70 miles per hour, with gusts that hit like a physical hammer, is scouring the Wyoming landscape, stripping the topsoil and piling it into drifts that could swallow a two-story farmhouse whole. Up there, the mercury has plummeted to 40 degrees below zero, a temperature where exposed skin freezes in less than 60 seconds and the very air feels like it is made of needles. But down here, 5 feet beneath the floor of the stable, it is 55 degrees Fahrenheit. It is quiet. It is still. The only sound is the rhythmic, heavy thump-thump of a 1,000-pound horse's heart directly above your head and the faint, sweet scent of cedar sawdust and curing hay. They called these suicide cellars when the first settlers began digging them into the hillsides of the Bighorn Basin. The neighbors, huddled in their traditional log cabins with wood stoves roaring at maximum capacity, thought it was a madness, born of isolation, to live like a badger beneath the feet of your livestock. But they were looking at the problem through the lens of surface logic. They were trying to fight the wind. And in a winter like this, the wind always wins. Here, in the Subterranean Sanctuary, we aren't fighting the storm. We are using the very physics of the earth and the biological heat of the animals to create a life support system that defies the blizzard. Think about that for a second. While the rest of the valley is fighting a losing battle against convection and heat loss, I am sitting here in a t-shirt, watching the blue flame of a small stove and listening to the horses breathe. This is the biothermal symbiosis. It is a forgotten branch of engineering that treats the animal above, not as a passenger, but as a furnace, a living, breathing thermal battery that generates 3,000 British thermal units of heat every single hour. Before we go any further into the blueprints of this sanctuary, before I show you how to calculate the dead air space and the twin pipe ventilation system that keeps the ice plugs from forming, you need to understand why. The world you think is safe is actually a fragile shell. If you find value in these forgotten ways, in the grit and the science of true self-reliance, ensure you are part of this journey by subscribing. Because when the White Death comes, the blueprints I'm about to show you won't just be a curiosity. They will be the only thing between you and a frozen grave. To understand why this subterranean room works, we have to go back to the winter of 1949. It remains the benchmark for atmospheric violence in the northern plains. It wasn't just a storm, it was a seasonal execution. In the intermontane valleys of Montana and Wyoming, the pressure gradients shifted in a way that created a literal cold cap of Arctic air that refused to move for weeks. Here's what everyone missed. The people who died in 1949 didn't usually die because they ran out of wood. They died because their homes were designed for the wrong kind of physics. A traditional log cabin, as beautiful as it may be, is a radiator. It sits in the path of the wind, and as that 70-mile-per-hour gale strips away the boundary layer of air around the wood, it sucks the heat out through a process called forced convection. You can have a fire so hot the chimney glows cherry red, and yet 3 feet away from the hearth, the water in your glass is turning to ice. The wind chill factor effectively turns a sturdy house into a sieve. By the third day of the 1949 blizzard, the snow had reached the eaves of the roofs. When that happens, the weight becomes the second killer. Packed snow isn't light. It isn't the fluffy powder of a Christmas card. In a sustained blizzard, the snow is hammered by the wind until it reaches a density of 20 to 30 pounds per cubic foot. Now, consider a 10-foot drift resting on a standard cabin roof. That imposes a dead load of 300 pounds per square foot. Let that sink in. A typical roof from that era was lucky to be rated for 40. Across the Bighorn Basin, the sound of the storm was punctuated by the horrific crack of main ridge beams snapping under the weight. Families were buried alive, not by the snow itself, but by the collapse of the very structures meant to protect them. But while the surface world was buckling, the old-timers who understood the bank barn philosophy were watching a different set of numbers. They understood that the Earth is the greatest thermal insulator ever devised by nature. If you go 60 inches deep into the soil of the northern United States, past the frost line, the temperature stops fluctuating with the seasons. It hits a steady, golden mean of 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. It doesn't matter if it's 100 degrees in July or 40 below in January. The Earth at that depth remains constant. This is due to thermal lag. Soil has a relatively low R value, roughly 0.25 per inch, which sounds unimpressive until you realize you aren't using 4 inches of it. You're using 60. That massive thickness creates a delay in temperature transfer so extreme that the heat of the previous summer is still migrating through the ground in the middle of winter. The numbers don't lie. The ground isn't just dirt. It's a battery that stores the sun's energy for months at a time. The engineering secret of the Subterranean Sanctuary I built under my barn was in marrying this planetary heat with the biological output of my horses. See, the stable floor above this room wasn't just a floor. It was a multi-layered heat exchanger. I excavated into the hillside, using the natural slope to create a bank effect. I set 8x8 pressure-treated Douglas fir posts into the grade, reinforced with masonry to handle the massive live load of the horses above. I wasn't just building a room, I was building a bunker that could support the weight of 2,000-pound animals, plus the 300 pounds per square foot of snow that I knew would eventually pile up over the barn roof. But you can't just dig a hole and throw some wood against the dirt. If you do that, you'll be dead of pneumonia or crushed by a cave-in within a month. The moisture in the soil is a relentless enemy. It wicks through wood, rotting it from the outside in, and it conducts heat away from your body far faster than dry air. This is why I designed the dead air gap. Between the raw earth of the excavation and the interior cedar paneling, I maintained a strict 2-inch void. This air gap acts as a thermal break. It prevents the conductive cooling of the earth from touching the interior walls, and it allows any moisture that seeps through the hill to drain away into a gravel subbase rather than soaking into my living quarters. And then, there is the horse. A mature, 1,000-pound horse is a metabolic engine. They eat high-fat grain and hay, and the process of digestion, specifically the fermentation of fiber in the hindgut, generates an incredible amount of internal heat. In the dead of winter, a horse's skin temperature remains warm, and their breath is a constant stream of humid, heated air. By placing my sanctuary directly beneath their stalls, I was utilizing the ceiling as a massive radiator. The heat from their bodies, combined with the natural decomposition of the bedding and manure in the stalls above, created a microclimate. The waste heat from the stable would seep down through the insulated flooring, trapped by the earth walls of my chamber. I remember the 4th night of the 1949 storm. I could hear the wind screaming through the gaps in the barn siding far above, a sound like 1,000 freight trains derailed in the dark. I knew the snow was already halfway up the barn doors. I knew that my neighbors were likely burning their furniture by then, desperate to keep the frost from the corners of their rooms. But I sat there, leaning against a Douglas fir post, and I reached out to touch the ceiling. It was warm to the touch. The horses were standing directly above me, their weight distributed across the heavy timbers, their life force radiating downward. It is a strange, primal feeling to realize that your survival is tied to the heartbeat of another species. If I didn't feed them, the furnace would go out. If I didn't manage their ventilation, they would suffocate, and I would follow shortly after. Most people see architecture as a way to separate themselves from the environment. They want a box that keeps the outside out. But in the intermontane West, that kind of thinking is a death sentence. True survival engineering is about integration. It's about realizing that the hill is your insulation, the horse is your heater, and the snow, once it reaches a certain depth, is actually your friend. Once the snow buried the barn, it acted as a secondary layer of insulation, sealing the entire structure in a giant white igloo. The wind could no longer reach the walls. The convection stopped. The entire barn, from the haylofts to my subterranean room, became a closed system. But that's when the real danger began. That's when the ice plug phenomenon starts to hunt you. When you're buried under 15 feet of snow, you are no longer breathing the atmosphere. You are breathing what you can pull through a pipe. And if that pipe isn't engineered with a forensic attention to detail, the moisture from your own breath will turn into a solid block of ice inside the vent, sealing you in a vacuum-tight tomb. I had spent months calculating the twin pipe system. I knew I couldn't rely on a single chimney. Most people think a stovepipe is enough. They think as long as there's a hole, air will move. But physics doesn't work on hope. In a subterranean room, you need a pressure differential. You need a dedicated fresh air intake pipe drawing from a wind-shielded area and a Class A insulated chimney pipe extending at least 3 feet above the highest expected snowdrift level. If those two pipes aren't perfectly balanced, the carbon monoxide from your stove won't rise. It will linger. It will pool on the floor like an invisible, odorless lake of sleep, and you will never wake up. As the blizzard of 49 reached its crescendo, I sat in the golden light of my lantern, watching the flame. The flame is the only honest thing in a bunker. If it flickers blue and strong, you have oxygen. If it starts to stretch and turn a sickly yellow, the carbon monoxide is winning. I watched that flame for 10 days, a silent witness to the war between my engineering and the white death outside. I was a student of the frost line, a disciple of the thermal mass, and as I heard the barn timbers groan under the weight of 100 tons of snow, I knew that I wasn't just surviving. I was proving that the old ways, the bank barns and the hillside dugouts, weren't the relics of a primitive past. They were the pinnacle of high-stakes physics. To truly appreciate the engineering of the Subterranean Sanctuary, we have to look past the finished room and into the raw, bleeding muscle of the construction process itself. It began in the high, dry heat of July, months before the first snowflake ever touched the Wyoming soil. While the rest of the valley was focused on the hay harvest and the branding of calves, I was standing on the south-facing slope of a ridge, a pickaxe in my calloused hands, and a blueprint etched into my mind that defied a century of conventional ranch architecture. The site selection was not an accident. It was the first and most critical calculation in the survival equation. The bank barn is a concept brought over by German and Swiss settlers who understood that a hill is not an obstacle, it is a thermal gift. By cutting into the side of a rise, you are essentially borrowing the Earth's mass as a permanent, unchanging wall. But you cannot simply dig a hole and expect it to hold. The geology of the Bighorn Basin is a complex layering of bentonite clay, sandstone, and ancient river silt. As I swung that pickaxe for the first time, the sound was a sharp, metallic clink against the parched earth, a reminder that this soil had been baked by the sun for thousands of years. Now, picture this. I wasn't just digging a cellar. I was carving out a specialized chamber that would sit exactly 60 inches below the surface grade. Why 60 inches? Because in the northern latitudes of the United States, that is the magic number. That is the frost line. Above that line, the Earth is a volatile thing, expanding, contracting, freezing, and thawing in a cycle that can snap concrete and heave foundations like they were made of toothpicks. But once you descend past that 5-foot mark, the world changes. The temperature stabilizes into a constant, rhythmic hum of 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. I spent 3 weeks in the July heat, moving tons of earth by hand and with a slip scraper hitched to a team of draft horses. Every cubic yard removed was a debt paid to the coming winter. As the hole deepened, the air inside the excavation began to change. On the surface, the sun was beating down at 95 degrees, but 6 feet down, at the bottom of my pit, the air was cool, damp, and smelled of ancient minerals and crushed stone. This was the first proof of the thermal lag. The earth I was touching was still holding on to the chill of the previous April. It is a slow-moving wave of temperature that takes months to migrate through the soil. By the time the January blizzards would arrive, this very spot would be releasing the warmth it had absorbed during the dog days of August. Think about that for a second. The Earth is a time machine for heat. Once the excavation was cleared to a dimension of 12 feet by 16 feet, the structural phase began. This was where most preppers or amateur builders fail. They underestimate the weight of the world. I wasn't just supporting a roof. I was supporting a stable floor, 2 1,000-pound horses, and eventually, the crushing deadload of 20 feet of packed snow. To handle this, I didn't use standard 2x4s or even 6x6s. I hauled in 8x8 pressure-treated Douglas fir posts, timber so heavy and dense that it felt like lifting columns of solid lead. Setting these posts was a lesson in forensic engineering. Each post was sunk into a 3-foot deep footing of reinforced masonry and gravel. I didn't want the wood to ever touch the raw dirt at the bottom because moisture is the silent thief of structural integrity. I poured a mix of cement and riverstone into the base, creating a pier that would distribute the vertical load. The numbers don't lie. I was designing for a combined live and dead load of over 400 pounds per square foot. If a single one of those Douglas fir posts bowed or shifted, the entire structure would become a subterranean trap. I remember the sound of the sledgehammer echoing in that pit, a dull, thudding rhythm as I trued the beams. Every strike was a commitment to the physics of the live load. Most people think about snow as something light and airy, but packed snow, hammered by 70-mile-per-hour winds, reaches a density that rivals ice. When you add the weight of 2 horses' animals that concentrate their entire mass onto 4 small hooves, the pressure on the floor joists becomes astronomical. I spaced my overhead beams only 12 inches apart, a density of timber that looked more like a ship's hull than a barn floor. But the real secret, the detail that kept me alive while others perished, was the dead air space. Here's what everyone missed. If you bolt your interior walls directly to the earth or the structural posts, you have created a thermal bridge. The cold from the surrounding ground will migrate through the wood, and moisture will begin to weep from the soil, rotting your sanctuary from the outside in. To prevent this, I engineered a 2-inch void between the raw earth wall and the interior cedar paneling. I installed a series of vertical furring strips, creating a dead air gap that acted as a secondary layer of insulation. This gap serves 2 vital functions. First, it utilizes the R value of stagnant air, which is significantly higher than that of damp soil. Second, it creates a drainage plane. If any moisture from the hillside managed to seep through the earth, it wouldn't hit my living space. It would trickle down the back of the gap and into a perimeter French drain I had installed at the base of the footings, a system of perforated pipe buried in a bed of washed river gravel. Let that sink in. Most survival structures are destroyed by the very earth meant to protect them. They are crushed by hydraulic pressure or rotted out by fungal growth. My sanctuary was designed to breathe within the hill. I used aromatic red cedar for the interior walls, not just for the smell, but because cedar is naturally resistant to rot and insects. As I nailed the tongue and groove planks into place, the scent of the wood filled the chamber, a sharp, clean fragrance that stood in stark contrast to the heavy, metallic scent of the wet clay behind the gap. Now, we must talk about the thermal battery interface, the ceiling. This was the most delicate part of the engineering process. The ceiling of my sanctuary was also the floor of the horse stalls. I had to create a barrier that was strong enough to support the animals and sealed well enough to prevent any liquid waste from seeping down, yet conductive enough to allow the horse's biological heat to radiate into my room. I used a triple-layer approach. The first layer, the one I looked up at from my bed, was the heavy Douglas fir joists and cedar planking. Above that, I laid a thick vapor barrier of oiled canvas and bitumen, a waterproof skin that ensured no moisture from the stalls could ever penetrate the sanctuary. Finally, on the stall side, I laid down 3-inch thick oak wear boards. Oak is one of the few woods tough enough to withstand the constant scraping of iron horseshoes. But here is the engineering nuance. I didn't insulate the ceiling. Every other wall in the room was protected by the dead air gap and the Earth's mass, but the ceiling was left thermally active. By doing this, I turned the floor of the barn into a giant radiator. A mature horse produces approximately 3,000 British thermal units of heat per hour through its metabolic processes. That heat is trapped in the bedding of the stall, usually a thick layer of straw and wood shavings. Because heat naturally moves toward cold, the warmth from the horses' bodies was pulled downward through the oak and the fir, radiating into the subterranean chamber. It was a symbiotic loop. I provided the horses with a stable that was sheltered from the wind and the worst of the cold, and in return, their very existence served as my primary heating element. I wasn't burning wood. I wasn't burning coal. I was burning the caloric energy of the hay the horses ate. As the construction moved into late August, I began the installation of the lifelines, the twin-pipe ventilation system. This is where the physics of the subterranean sanctuary becomes a matter of life and death. In a confined space, 5 feet underground, the greatest threat isn't the cold, it's the air you breathe. Every breath you take releases moisture and carbon dioxide. In a sealed room, that moisture will condense on the walls, and the carbon dioxide will pool on the floor. I used 4-inch diameter galvanized steel piping for the intake and the exhaust, but I didn't just run them straight up. I engineered a U-trap into the intake line. This was designed to catch any wind-blown snow that might make it into the pipe, allowing it to melt and collect in a small sump rather than clogging the airflow. The exhaust pipe was even more critical. It had to be a Class A insulated pipe, the kind used for high-temperature wood stoves, even though it was only carrying my breath and the heat from a small lantern. The reason for the insulation was to prevent the ice plug. When warm, moist air from a human or a small stove hits the sub-zero temperatures of the surface, it flash freezes. If the pipe is uninsulated, that ice builds up layer by layer, like a slow-growing cataract, until the pipe is completely sealed. By using an insulated chimney that extended 4 feet above the barn's roofline, I ensured that the exhaust air would stay warm enough to exit the system before it could freeze. I remember the day I finished the final seal. I stood in the center of the 12 by 16 room, lit a single beeswax candle, and watched the flame. It was perfectly still. No drafts. No flickering from the wind that was already beginning to pick up on the surface. The silence was absolute, a heavy, pressurized quiet that you only find deep within the earth. I reached out and touched the cedar wall. It felt solid, permanent, a fortress, carved from the very hill that would soon be buried under a sea of white. The neighbors would often stop by during those final weeks of autumn. They'd look at the mounded earth and the heavy timber framing of the barn above and shake their heads. They saw it as an eccentricity, a waste of good timber to build something so over-engineered. They were still thinking in terms of the bighorn summer, a world of wide-open spaces and gentle breezes. They hadn't seen the barometric pressure dropping in the way I had. They hadn't felt the metallic taste in the air that signals a century storm. I ignored them. I was busy calculating the R value of the snow itself. Once the blizzard hit, the snow would pile up against the barn, and I knew that if I could get the drifts to reach the eaves, the snow would become my final layer of insulation. Snow has an R value of approximately 1 per inch. If I were buried under 10 feet of snow, I would have an additional R120 protective shell around the entire structure. This is the irony of subterranean survival. The very thing that is trying to kill you, the snow, becomes the thing that saves you. But you have to have the structural integrity to hold it. If your roof isn't designed for 300 pounds per square foot, the snow is a tombstone. If it is designed correctly, the snow is a blanket. By the end of September, the sanctuary was complete. I had stocked the shelves with 300 pounds of dried grains, salt-cured meats, and glass jars of tallow. I had a small, efficient cast-iron stove, not for heat, as the horses and the earth provided that, but for cooking and for the psychological comfort of a flame. I had a battery of thermometers, one for the surface, one for the stall level, and one for my living quarters. I spent the first few nights down there just to test the atmospheric balance. It was 52 degrees on the nose. Above me, I could hear the horses moving in their stalls, the dull thud of a hoof and the rhythmic crunch as they chewed their evening hay. Their heat was already migrating downward. The ceiling felt like a warm stone in the sun. The biothermal symbiosis was active. I remember looking at the calendar on the wall. October was coming, and with it, the first of the mountain squalls. But I wasn't looking at the horizon anymore. I was looking at the physics of the hill. I had built a room that existed outside of the surface world's rules. I had traded the view from a cabin window for the security of the frost line. I had utilized the thermal mass of the planet and the biological engine of the horse to create a pocket of 1949 that would remain untouched by the coming apocalypse. Every nail I had driven, every bucket of dirt I had hauled, and every calculation of the dead air gap was about to be put to the ultimate test. The White Death was coming, a storm that would reshape the geography of the West and break the spirits of men who thought they were masters of the land. But down here, beneath the 8x8 Douglas fir and the 60 inches of earth, the numbers were already in my favor. The numbers don't lie, and they were the only thing that would keep my heart beating when the rest of the world turned to ice. To understand the true lethality of a subterranean space, you have to stop thinking about the cold and start thinking about the air. In the engineering world, we often talk about the envelope of a building, but in a survival shelter buried under 5 feet of earth and 15 feet of snow, that envelope becomes a sealed lung. If that lung fails to exhale, or if it fails to inhale, the result is a quiet, painless, and absolute end. The most common mistake made by those who attempt to build these hillside retreats is the reliance on a single ventilation point. They think a single pipe, sticking out of the ground like a snorkel, is enough to sustain life. It isn't. Not when the barometric pressure is swinging wildly and the outside air is 40 degrees below zero. This brings us to the mandatory twin pipe system, the very heart of the sanctuary's life support engineering. I designed the system to utilize a natural pressure differential. One pipe, the fresh air intake, was positioned on the leeward side of the structure, drawing from a wind-shielded area. The second pipe, the exhaust, was a Class A insulated chimney. Now, the insulation here isn't to keep you warm. It's to keep the exhaust gases warm. You see, when you burn a small stove or even just breathe, you are releasing moisture. If that warm, moist air hits a cold, uninsulated metal pipe that is surrounded by sub-zero snow, the moisture doesn't just condense, it desublimates. It turns instantly into ice. This is the ice plug phenomenon. Layer by microscopic layer, the frost builds up on the interior of the pipe until the opening is no longer 4 inches wide, but 3, then 2, then nothing. If you are sleeping when that final seal forms, the carbon monoxide from your stove or the carbon dioxide from your own lungs will have nowhere to go. It will begin to pool. Carbon monoxide is particularly insidious because it is nearly the same density as air, but it binds to your hemoglobin 200 times more effectively than oxygen. It doesn't scream, it doesn't smell, it simply puts you to sleep and never lets you wake up. To prevent this, my exhaust pipe didn't just stop at the roofline. It was engineered to extend a minimum of 3 feet above the highest expected snowdrift level. I had calculated that in a worst-case Wyoming winter, the drifts against the barn could reach 20 feet. Therefore, my chimney was a towering, insulated spire that reached toward the sky, braced against the barn's main ridge beam with steel tension cables. It had to be high enough to catch the scouring effect of the wind, which helps pull the exhaust out of the pipe through the Venturi effect. And then, we have to consider the furnace. I've mentioned that the horses were my primary heat source, but let's look at the actual physics of that biothermal output. A mature 1,000-pound horse is essentially a massive walking fermentation vat. As they break down the cellulose in hay, their hindgut produces heat as a metabolic byproduct. The numbers don't lie. Each of those animals was radiating between 2,500 and 3,000 British thermal units every single hour. With 2 horses in the stalls above, I had nearly 6,000 BTUs of constant, radiant heat pressing down into my ceiling. For context, a standard, small electric space heater puts out about 5,000 BTUs. I was living beneath 2 heaters that never turned off. But a heater is only as good as its fuel. This is the caloric factor that many people miss in a survival situation. To keep that biothermal engine running, I couldn't just feed the horses their summer rations. I had to increase their intake of high-fat grains and heavy alfalfa. I was essentially feeding the horses so that they could feed me with their warmth. I remember the meticulous ritual of those early winter days. I would climb the ladder from my sanctuary into the barn, the temperature dropping 40 degrees in the span of 10 feet. I would check the horses' coats. If they were shivering, my furnace was failing. I would check the bedding. I needed that manure and straw to be damp and deep because the decomposition process itself The microbial action within the deep litter system added another 500 BTUs to the floor's thermal output. It was a layered system of biological heat: the horse's breath, the horse's skin, and the fermenting floor beneath their hooves. But then, the 2nd of January, 1949, arrived. The morning began with a sky the color of a bruised plum. The barometer didn't just drop, it plummeted. The needle on my wall-mounted gauge swinging towards stormy with a violent urgency I had never seen before. By noon, the wind had shifted from a northern breeze to a sustained western howl. This was the start of the record-breaking blizzard that would eventually be known as the White Death. Within 4 hours, the visibility on the surface had dropped to zero. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. The snow wasn't falling in flakes, it was falling in sheets, pulverized by the 70-mile-per-hour gusts into a fine, abrasive powder that found its way into every crack and crevice. I retreated into the sanctuary, sealing the heavy, insulated hatch behind me. I listened to the sound of the barn above the terrifying groan of the timbers as the snow began to pile up. By the second day, the light from the small, high-set windows in the barn had vanished. We were being buried. I sat in my 12 by 16 room, watching the thermometer. On the surface, the temperature had crashed to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. In the barn stalls, it was a precarious 5 degrees. But in my subterranean chamber, it was a rock-steady 52. The thermal mass of the earth was doing its job. The 5 feet of soil and the 60 inches of depth were acting as a massive heat sink, refusing to let the surface's volatility penetrate the sanctuary. But on the third day, the air changed. I woke up with a dull, throbbing ache behind my eyes, the first sign of oxygen deprivation or carbon monoxide buildup. I looked at the candle on my table. The flame was no longer a sharp, vertical spear of yellow light. It was blooming, growing large, orange, and flickering with a sickly, rhythmic pulse. It was struggling to find oxygen. I realized with a jolt of pure, cold adrenaline that my twin pipe system had failed. Despite the Class A insulation, despite the U-trap, the sheer volume of moisture from my own breath and the horse's respiration had found a way to seal the intake. Or perhaps the snow had drifted so high and so fast that it had capped the pipes. I grabbed my heavy wool coat and scrambled up the ladder to the stall level. The barn was silent, a heavy, muffled silence that was more terrifying than the wind. The snow had completely encased the structure. It was an igloo of massive proportions. The horses were agitated, their breath coming in white, ragged plumes that hung in the air like ghosts. They were sensing the thinning of the air. I reached the area where the intake pipe entered the barn. I put my ear to the galvanized steel. Nothing. No hiss of incoming air. I tried to blow into the pipe, but there was zero give. It was a solid, frozen block of ice. I looked at my watch. If I couldn't clear that pipe, the oxygen in the sanctuary and the barn would be depleted within the hour. The horses would be the first to go, their large lungs exhausting the remaining air, and I would follow shortly after. The snow outside was likely 15 feet deep over the intake. I couldn't dig my way out, not in a 70-mile-per-hour wind at 40 below. I would be dead of exposure before I moved a cubic yard of snow. I had to clear the pipe from the inside. I raced back down into the sanctuary and grabbed my small plumber's blowtorch and a long coil of heavy-gauge copper wire. This is where the engineering becomes a desperate, improvised dance. I heated the end of the copper wire until it glowed cherry red, and I began to feed it into the intake pipe. I could hear it hiss as it touched the ice plug. Minutes felt like hours. I would retract the wire, reheat it, and shove it back into the dark throat of the pipe. The headache was worsening. My movements were becoming sluggish, my thoughts turning into a thick, slow syrup. I was in the middle of a feedback loop. I needed oxygen. To think clearly enough to get more oxygen, I reached a point where the wire wouldn't go any further. I had hit a bend in the pipe, or the plug was too thick. In a moment of sheer, desperate clarity, I realized the moisture wasn't just at the top of the pipe. It had pooled in the U-trap I had so carefully designed. The trap that was supposed to save me had become my executioner. The snow that had blown in during the first hours of the storm had melted from the warmth of the barn. then refrozen when the temperatures dropped further. I took the blowtorch and began to heat the exterior of the galvanized pipe itself, right at the base of the U. This is a dangerous game. Heating a sealed pipe can cause it to rupture, or the fumes from the heated zinc coating can be toxic. But I had no choice. I watched the metal turn from a dull gray to a shimmering, iridescent blue. Then, I heard it. A pop, followed by the sound of rushing water. A slug of melted ice and slush broke free and drained into the sump. And then, the most beautiful sound I have ever heard in my life. A sharp, piercing whistle of air. The pressure differential was re-establishing itself. The cold, 40 below air from the surface was being sucked into the pipe, driven by the vacuum I had created in the room. I collapsed against the Douglas fir post, gasping for the freezing, metallic-tasting air. The candle flame on the table suddenly straightened, turning back into a bright, confident needle of light. The horses above let out a long, collective huff of relief. We were breathing again, but the storm wasn't over. For 7 more days, the 1949 blizzard held the Bighorn Basin in its teeth. For 7 more days, I lived in that 12 by 16 room, listening to the world disappear. I became a master of the sound of the sanctuary. I could tell the depth of the snow by the way the vibrations of the wind changed. In the beginning, there was a high-pitched whine as the wind hit the barn's siding. By the 4th day, that was replaced by a dull, low-frequency thrumming as the snow reached the eaves. By the 6th day, there was only silence. We were entombed. I spent those days in a state of hyper-awareness. I checked the pipes every hour on the hour. I fed the horses their high-caloric grain like it was medicine. I monitored the thermometer with a forensic intensity. The data I collected during those 10 days remains some of the most compelling evidence for subterranean architecture ever recorded. The surface temperature averaged minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit for the duration of the storm. The temperature in the main part of the barn, which was effectively an unheated attic at that point, hovered around 5 to 10 degrees. But the subterranean sanctuary, even during the coldest snap of the storm, it never dropped below 51 degrees. Think about that for a second. A 46-degree temperature difference maintained with zero mechanical heating. No furnace, no electricity, no massive woodpile, just 60 inches of earth, a 2-inch air gap, and 2,000 pounds of horse. The biothermal symbiosis wasn't just a theory anymore. It was a proven mechanical reality. I was sitting in a t-shirt, reading a book by the light of a single candle, while 50 feet away, cattle were literally freezing to death where they stood. The snow load on the roof had reached its maximum. I estimated there was nearly 400 pounds of pressure per square foot on the barn's frame. I could hear the 8x8 posts creaking under the strain, a sound like a ship's hull in a heavy sea. But the Douglas fir held. The masonry footings didn't budge. As the storm finally began to break on the 10th day, the barometric pressure surged. I climbed the ladder and looked through the small, reinforced spy hole I had cut into the barn's upper door. All I saw was white. The snow was a solid wall against the glass. We were buried under nearly 20 feet of drift. I wasn't worried. I knew the ice plug would not return as long as the air was moving. I knew the horses were warm. I knew I had enough salt-cured meat and tallow to last another month if necessary. But more than that, I knew I had cracked the code of the intermontane winter. I had stopped fighting the White Death and had instead invited it to be my insulation. The neighbors' traditional cabins, those radiators in the wind, had long since become frozen boxes. In the weeks that followed, the stories began to trickle in. Stories of families huddled around single candles, their breath freezing on their blankets, their livestock dead in the fields. They had relied on the logic of the surface, and the surface had betrayed them. I looked up at the ceiling of my sanctuary, at the warm oak boards that held the weight of my horses. I could hear the rhythmic clump-clump of their hooves as they shifted in the straw. They were sweating in the 5-degree air of the barn because their biological heat was trapped against the snow-insulated walls. They were thriving. I was thriving. This is the power of ancestral modernity. It is the realization that the most advanced survival system isn't a high-tech bunker with a diesel generator. It is a hole in the ground, engineered with an understanding of thermal lag, biothermal output, and the relentless physics of the Earth. The numbers don't lie. The Earth wants to keep you at 55 degrees. The horse wants to keep you at 3,000 BTUs. All you have to do is build a room that is smart enough to let them. The 1949 blizzard was a reset button for the West. It taught us that our architecture was arrogant. It taught us that the wind is a thief of heat. But for me, in the silence of the Subterranean Sanctuary, it was a vindication. I had survived the record breaker not by being stronger than the storm, but by being deeper than the frost. And as I prepared to dig my way out to the sun, I knew that the blueprints I had etched into the cedar walls of that room were the only true map to safety in a world that can turn to ice in a heartbeat. When the shovel finally broke through the final 3 inches of the wind-hardened crust, the light was so intense it felt like a physical blow to the eyes. After 10 days in the amber-hued sanctuary of red cedar and beeswax candles, the world above was a searing, monochromatic landscape of violet shadows and blinding white plains. But I didn't look at the horizon first. I didn't even look at the sun. I turned back to the ladder and looked at the row of brass-rimmed thermometers mounted to the 8x8 Douglas fir support post. This was the moment of absolute forensic truth. This was where the theory of biothermal symbiosis met the unyielding reality of the 1949 winter. The numbers don't lie. And the ledger I had kept during those 240 hours of entombment was a revelation of subterranean physics. On the surface, the mercury had bottomed out at a staggering minus 44 degrees Fahrenheit during the darkest hours of the 6th night. The wind chill, though impossible to measure once we were buried, would have stripped the life from a warm-blooded animal in minutes. In the upper loft of the barn, only 12 feet above my head, the temperature had hovered at a brutal 8 degrees above zero. But here, in the heart of the hill, the thermometer had never wavered more than 2 degrees. It sat at a rock-steady 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Let that sink in. While the world above was experiencing a temperature swing of nearly 80 degrees, the subterranean chamber was as stable as a tomb. I began the post-storm audit with a methodical, almost obsessive attention to detail. I wanted to see where the engineering had nearly failed and where it had triumphed. I ran my hand along the aromatic red cedar of the interior walls. Thanks to the 2-inch dead air gap I had carved between the wood and the raw earth, there was no condensation, no weeping moisture, no rot. The air gap had allowed the thermal lag of the earth to radiate inward, without the conductive bridge of damp soil. The wood was bone dry. Then, I looked at the ceiling, the floor of the horse stalls. This was the radiator of the system. I climbed back up into the barn to check the furnace itself. Here's what everyone missed. When I opened the heavy oak door to the stalls, a cloud of thick, white steam billowed out into the cold barn air. It looked like a forest fire in slow motion. That steam was the condensed biological heat of the horses. I walked over to my 2-year-old gelding and placed my hand deep into his winter coat. He wasn't shivering. He wasn't tucked up in the corners. In fact, he was slightly damp with sweat. Think about that for a second. In a barn that was only 8 degrees, these animals were so well insulated by the snow-covered walls and so energized by the high-caloric grain I had provided that they were actually running hot. Their metabolic engines had been running at peak efficiency for 10 days. They had consumed nearly double their normal ration of alfalfa and oats, and in exchange, they had turned that fuel into 6,000 British thermal units of radiant heat every single hour. That heat had seeped into the oak wearboards, traveled through the heavy timbers, and maintained the ceiling of my sanctuary at a temperature that felt like a warm stone in the sun. The biothermal symbiosis had worked perfectly. I had provided the shelter and the fuel, and the horses had provided the climate. But the true shock, the moment that solidified the necessity of this architecture, came when I finally cleared the barn doors and looked out toward the neighboring ranch. The 1949 blizzard had not been kind to those who relied on surface logic. As the sun began to catch the ridges of the drifts, I saw them. On the cattle, they were found standing up, frozen mid-stride, their bodies turned into statues of ice by the relentless convection of the 70-mile-per-hour winds. They had plenty of space. They had plenty of air. But they had no thermal mass. They were radiators in a world of absolute zero, and the wind had simply sucked the life out of them until their hearts stopped. My neighbor's cabin, a beautiful log structure that had been the pride of the valley, was barely visible. They had survived, but only by the skin of their teeth. They had burned their dining table and 2 chairs, just to keep the frost from creeping across the floor. They told me later that they had spent the entire 10 days huddled within 3 feet of the hearth, and even then, the water in their wash basin had frozen solid. They were fighting the wind with fire, a losing battle of consumption versus convection. I had survived in a t-shirt by nesting within the hill. Now, picture this: the silence of a world reset by the snow. As I stood on top of the drift that had once been my roof, I realized that the Subterranean Sanctuary wasn't just a survival shelter. It was a philosophical statement. For centuries, we have been taught that to be civilized is to separate ourselves from the earth to build higher, to use more glass, to fight the elements with sheer mechanical force. We build boxes that require constant, violent infusions of energy, just to remain habitable. But the hill? The hill doesn't require a generator. The frost line doesn't need a thermostat. The horse doesn't need a furnace. When you align your engineering with the constant laws of physics, thermal lag, conductive brakes, and biological radiators, you stop being a victim of the climate. You become a part of it. I look down at the twin-pipe ventilation system, the galvanized steel chimneys now standing clear of the snow. They were the only visible sign that a human life was pulsing beneath the white blanket. They were the lungs of the hill. The ice plug that had nearly killed me was a reminder that even in a perfect system, the margin for error is measured in inches. If I hadn't understood the pressure differential, if I hadn't insulated those pipes, I would have been just another statistic of the 1949 blizzard. This is the lesson of the Subterranean Sanctuary. Survival is not a contest of strength. It is a contest of integration. It is the wisdom to know that the very snow trying to bury you is also the blanket that can keep you warm. It is the humility to realize that a 1,000-pound horse is a better heater than a cord of wood. This is what I call ancestral modernity. It is taking the forgotten observations of the old-timers, the bank barn builders, and the sod house dwellers, and refining them with the forensic precision of modern structural engineering. As the sun began to set on that first day of freedom, casting long blue shadows across the Wyoming desert, I felt a profound sense of vindication. I hadn't just endured the storm. I had observed it from a position of subterranean stability. I had watched the white death pass over me like a shadow, unable to touch the 52-degree sanctuary I had carved from the clay. Don't build a bunker to hide from the world. Build a sanctuary to live in it. If you want the technical blueprints for the twin-pipe ventilation system, the exact measurements for the dead air gap, and the load-bearing specifications for the Douglas fir support columns, you will find the link in the description. Study them. Understand the physics of the frost line, because the weather isn't getting any more predictable, and when the next century storm rolls across the plains, your life might just depend on that 2-inch gap between the wood and the world. The numbers don't lie, and neither does the hill. Stay deep, stay warm, and most importantly, stay breathing. I'll see you in the next deep dive into the architecture of survival.